Hello, my name's Wendy Phillips. I'm representing the British Toy and Hobby Association today with our strapline industry support for effective enforcement, and I'm providing you with some virtual toy safety training. This is about my seventh try at this. I've got tractors going up the road, I've been coughing, I've had interruptions of notifications, so forgive me. I'm just going to crack on through and we'll all get through this together. So thank you for your indulgence and your patience. The agenda for today is I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the British Toy and Hobby Association. I'm going to talk about the requirements of the Toy Safety Directive, which are also the requirements of the Toy Safety Regulations. I'll talk to you about economic operators, as you need to know the responsibilities of these for effectively enforcing the directive. And also I'll talk a bit about conformity assessments and compliance strategies. So the British Toy and Hobby Association has around 130 members. It goes up and down depending on the year. And we represent about 90% of the UK toy market. Our members are importers, manufacturers and retailers that make their own brands. We have a technical committee, and the technical committee is made up of member companies, and we talk about standards, we talk about directives, we talk about product safety, regulations, that sort of thing. We also host the UK's interpretations group. This is a group that consists of labs, manufacturers, retailers, and this really is set up to interpret any particularly difficult issues within standards. And interpretations made are all published on the British Toy and Hobby Association's website, so you can have a look at those. And as you're probably aware, it's those sort of grey areas of interpretation that can cause some of the issues with compliance. The interpretations group also can receive requests from trading standards should you have any issues such as that. We also, as an association, provide guidance, education and advice to members and also to trading standards. We work with the UK government bodies, and we also lobby via the EU via TIE. And as you can imagine, we've been trying to work quite closely with the UK government, especially on matters related to Brexit. Excuse me. So why are we doing this today, and why do we support enforcement? Well, the Toy Safety Directive is there to protect children from unsafe toys, and toy safety is obviously paramount to the BTHA. We also have the toy industry representation to consider. Responsible brands are actually damaged when there's a safety issue, even if it's not their own safety issue. All the toy companies sort of become marred by it. And lastly, we really need a level playing field. Those companies that don't, that try to comply do face greater costs than those that actually don't. And I'd like you just to consider, as we go through the presentation and all the responsibilities that I talk about toy companies having, is just how much this must cost if you're doing it correctly. Increasing legislation does not affect those who are already not complying. If they're not complying with existing rules, if a limit's changed for lead or there's a new standard out for EN71 with an amendment, they're just not going to comply if they're not already complying. And compliant companies and their products, we're competing on price with non-compliant products, and you will see this in particular now with the online marketplaces. The evidence the strong evidence that's coming out of any studies that are done on all types of products shows that really the marketplaces, the products on there are just not complying and they're unsafe. And again, I'd ask you just to consider, as we go through the presentation, the costs that must be involved in compliance. Excuse me. So what do toys need to comply with? We obviously have the Toy Safety Regulations, which is our overarching regulation, but there are many, many others. There's batteries and accumulators, the Low Voltage Directive, waste electrical and electronic equipment, restriction of hazardous substances, and then we have REACH, which is in addition to those, radio equipment, food imitation regulations, packaging waste, cosmetic products, drones, cosmetics, connected products. There's many more than on this list. This list is non-exhaustive. And then also we have Brexit to deal with as we're moving forward. So I know you don't enforce a lot of these, but some of them you obviously do. So again, just to highlight what we're dealing with at the moment, this chart just shows the rate of change for standards that are relevant to the toy industry. So the BTHA, we have a list of standards that we monitor that are relevant to toys. So, and we also look at the change in those standards. So for example, 2013, there were 13 standards removed, there were 14 added, the difference was 1. So the number of total changes in that year that a company had to deal with was 27. So we've monitored that from 2013 to date. And in total, there are 343 changes to standards that were of relevance to toy companies. And we think that Brexit will probably, not immediately, but in the future, will bring even more changes. So again, those companies that are trying to comply and keep up to date, that's quite a lot of work. And this is just standards. This is not regulations or directives or anything like that. So I'll talk about the toy safety regulations now, because this is our main piece of legislation. So I'll give you a brief overview of the UK toy safety regulations. I'll review the links between the regulations and the Toy Safety Directive. I'll talk about enforcement action that can be taken. This really is a summary only. I think, in terms of enforcement, you know far more than we know. And obviously this will need to be amended for Brexit or post-Brexit. So the legal basis and scope of the Toy Safety Regulations. So this really is the UK transposition of the Toy Safety Directive 2009. Excuse me. It applied to toys placed on the market on or after the 19th of August 2011. It defines the scope of it. So toys are products designed or intended, whether or not exclusively, for use in play by children under 14 years of age. And there are exclusions, things like automatic playing machines, toy vehicles with combustion engines. One of the exclusions, which does cause some issues sometimes, is the slings and catapults exclusion. It can be hard to determine what the safety requirements are of those if they're found in toys, because they are excluded from the Toy Safety Directive. So enforcement of the Toy Safety Regulations, it covers two main areas. The first area is a formal non-compliance, which actually results in an action, or the action is a compliance notice. And this would include things like the lack of CE marking, inappropriate CE marking, incomplete technical documentation, absence of a declaration of conformity, that type of thing. So that's a formal non-compliance. But then you also have the toys presenting a risk. There's a different thing here. The action really is to carry out a risk assessment, require the company to carry out corrective action, perhaps serve a withdrawal notice or recall notice. This obviously depends on the evaluation of the risk. And I think there's a PAS standard which can be used. It's a code of practice which can be used to help in these matters. One thing just to note, because many of the items that have enforcement action is chemical non-compliances. Now, the evaluation of risk is subject to much debate with other things, but in particular with the chemical risk. Perhaps a non-compliance with a chemical standard may not present the level of risk that would require perhaps a recall or a withdrawal. So I think that there needs to be a particular qualification to be able to evaluate chemical risk, toxicologist, that type of thing. So just in summary, the UK regulations transpose the general requirements of the Toy Safety Directive and is the legal basis for compliance and enforcement in the UK. The particular safety requirements are defined in the Toy Safety Directive, and these may change over time. I'll come on to those in a minute. So really what we're saying is, at the moment, until Brexit, the Toy Safety Directive is the technical reference that toy operators follow. It's all very complex. So what the British Toy and Hobby Association have done is we've produced a series of guides. You may have seen these before, but we have 8 guides, I think. And the first guide is Introduction to the Toy Safety Directive and related guidance. That's really a map of all the other guidance. We have a guide on obligations of economic operators, technical documentation, markings and warnings, conformative series production, safety assessments, product monitoring, and conformity assessments. So if I could use the word for dummies, these really are taking the complex legal text of the Toy Safety Directive into just manuals for dummies about actually what these things mean, and they've been very well received. They've been around for a long time now, and they are also assured. They are assured as primary authority advice by our primary authority, Milton Keynes Council. So really the fundamentals of toy safety, of compliance really, is to demonstrate that a toy is safe, and all the other stuff really is just amounting to that sort of central pillar, if you like. So that's all very well, but what actually does it mean for a toy to be safe? Well, within the directive, there are safety requirements, and there are the essential safety requirements, and there are which are sort of split into two. So there's the general safety requirements, which are set out in certain paragraphs, and there are particular safety requirements which are set out in an annex of the directive. And at the moment, the regulations refer to those annexes, but in future they'll be brought into the regulations. So the essential safety requirements basically say toys must be safe. This is not a quotation, this is just a translation. When they are used as intended or in a foreseeable way, bearing in mind the behaviour of children, that's always difficult, and considering the ability of users and their supervisors, particularly in the case for toys for children under 3. So if you imagine the ability of a child under 3 to not put everything in their mouth is very different to a 7-year-old child. That's what that sort of means. We have to consider the normal, their foreseeable or normal period of use. And the essential safety requirements really mean that you can also have inherent hazards and risk of harm involving the toy. So you can have small parts in toys, but you can draw attention to them using markings and instructions. So in order to avoid such risks, if you didn't have that caveat there, you wouldn't be able to have items, toys such as, the well-known construction sets, that sort of thing, because they need to be small parts. So you can actually have warnings when you've got inherent hazards and risks that you can't actually get rid of. So that's one set of requirements. And then you have the particular safety requirements, which are more prescriptive. So the particular safety requirements are listed, and they have more detail in the directive, which we'll come on to, but the particular safety requirements listed are mechanical and physical, flammability, chemical, electrical, hygiene, and radioactivity. So knowing all that, what actually do companies have to do? Well, before we actually get into what they actually have to do, you have to decide what role does a company have for the toy concerned? So what economic operator are they? Because it depends on the economic operator, it depends on what their role is and what actually their obligations are. So there are 4 roles. There are the manufacturers, the importers, the distributors, and the authorised representatives. One company may have multiple roles across their range of products, depending on the brand or the item. So you're not just a manufacturer or just an importer. So for example, here, you can see that a retailer, actually one retailer, such as, let's say, Argos, can have 3 economic operator roles. So for 3 different toys, they may be different things. So if they're making their own brand, they are the manufacturer. If they're actually distributing a European brand, even if they import it or not, they are actually just defined as the distributor. And if they're importing a non-EU company's products, they are the retailer. Within the Economic Operators Guide, the BTHA guide, there is a way, the chart to work out what you actually are and then what your obligations are. So it's just to demonstrate that one company can have multiple responsibilities. So what do companies have to do in short? Well, a manufacturer has to ensure that the toys comply with the essential safety requirements, which is the general and particular we've just been through, and they also have to build a technical file. This is just in short. Importers place only compliant toys on the market and ensure the manufacturer has built the technical file, and the distributor has to take due care and verify warnings. So this is not all the requirements, it's just showing that there is an increasing level of responsibility as you go up or down the supply chain. And there's also the fourth economic operator, which is an authorised representative, which we'll come to in a minute. So within the economic operator's guide, there is this lovely chart. And on the left-hand side, it shows all the obligations on the left-hand side. And then across the top, you can see manufacturers, importers, distributors, and authorised representatives. Excuse me. And you can see that the manufacturers have far more obligations than importers, and more obligations than the distributors, and more obligations than authorised representatives. So you can see the increasing level of responsibility as you move up to the manufacturers. So this chart can be used if you're talking to a company, and you can define what they are. So within the guide, there is further guidance about how to carry out the obligations. So this is just, well, I won't go through detail, but this is a page on manufacturers, and as you can see, the obligations are listed on the left-hand side. The writing in the blue colour points you to other guides within the series. So draw up the technical documentation, it points you to the technical documentation guide, for example. The importer's obligations are also listed and pointed to guides as and when they are applicable. The distributor's obligations, again, we've got those in the guide, and then there's a bit on authorised representatives. So these are all within the guides. These guides will obviously be rewritten after Brexit to reflect the UK regulations. So these are the manufacturer obligations. So if you're talking to a company and they have their own brand and they're based in the EU, this is what you would be expecting them to do. So they need to have drawn up the technical documentation, they need to have it for 10 years, they need to carry out the conformity and safety assessments, draw up the EC Declaration of Conformity. In future, that will be the UK Declaration of Conformity, and retain it for 10 years. They have to put the product markings on there. They have to ensure conformity of series production, which we'll come on to later. They have to add their name and address. They have to make sure that everything's in the correct language. They need to bring non-conforming toys into compliance, and they need to inform you if they found a safety risk, and they need to recall or withdraw as applicable, depending on the risk. They need to provide information to you should you request it. Manufacturers also need to sample test marketed toys. So that's just that in the directive itself, it says taking into account risk. So if you have an item with a low risk product, perhaps you wouldn't do that one, but you'd probably pick another toy and perhaps test for a higher risk area, such as phthalates. So you could have a sample test program. And also the last thing is to keep a register of complaints, non-conforming toys and recalls, and to inform distributors of this monitoring. So there's quite a number of obligations there. Importers, slightly different. So if you can see the first one there, they have to ensure the technical documentation, conformity assessments are available and retained for 10 years. That doesn't mean to say they have to have them. They have to make sure they're available. They have to keep a copy of the EC Declaration of Conformity for 10 years. They have to ensure the manufacturer has put the right markings on the product. They have to add their name and address onto the toy or packaging. Mostly it's packaging, because you shouldn't need to open the packaging to place the importer marking on the product. That would just be silly. They have to ensure the required documents like instructions and safety information are in the correct language, which in this case is English. They also have to sample test marketed toys, taking into account risk. So we do say that really that the importers shouldn't really duplicate the testing that manufacturers have done, and vice versa. They also have to keep a register of complaints, non-conforming toys and recalls, and an extra obligation for them is that they don't jeopardise compliance during storage or transport. So the manufacturer obviously has their obligations for their toy, but then if it's then stored in I don't know if it's a wax product that's stored in a hot warehouse, that's outside of the manufacturer's control really. So this is why the importer has this obligation. And then we have distributor obligations. And again, you can see sort of a slight dilution of things. So then the words ensure have changed to verify. So they have to verify the right conformity markings on the product. They have to verify that the manufacturer's names and addresses are on the product. They have to ensure the instructions are in the right language, and then they have the same obligations here as the others. So bring non-conforming toys into compliance, inform authorities if there's a safety risk, recall or withdraw, provide information to authorities on request. One of the key things here is that they don't have any responsibility for compliance of the toy or technical documentation, but what they do have is an obligation to identify the other economic operators in each toy supply chain. So if you go to a distributor and say, well, this toy is not compliant, show me your technical documentation, they can say, well, I can't show you it, but I can tell you the supply chain and I know who the importer was, or I know who the manufacturer is. Authorised representatives. This is a bit different. So, and we might see more of this after Brexit, but a manufacturer may, and they have to use a written mandate, appoint an authorised representative. So we would imagine that many EU companies will probably use this route after Brexit to have a UK authorised representative. The drawing up of the technical documentation shall not form part of the authorised representative's mandate. So they're not allowed to do that. So you can't have a Chinese manufacturer passing all the responsibility onto the EU or UK authorised representative to do all that for them. They're not allowed to do it. The mandate shall allow the authorised representative to do the following. And when we say allow, we think that they should be doing it. So they should be keeping the EC Declaration of Conformity and technical documentation available for the 10-year rule applies. They as the authorised representative, they need to provide information to authorities on request. And they also need to cooperate with authorities on any action to eliminate risks posed by toys covered by the mandate. So basically, you know, they're your person if the manufacturer is outside of the EU and they've used an authorised representative. So they'll be the people that you speak with. So that's all very well, but how can you as enforcement officers tell that all this has been done? The main route really, well the only route really, is by the technical documentation, which is the method by which a manufacturer has demonstrated the compliance with the safety requirements of the Toy Safety Directive, which should be documented in the technical file. So you can go in and say, I need your technical file, and then you can check that everything that is obligated has been done. Often there's a misconception that the test certification is the way to show compliance, and it's not. It can be part of the technical documentation required. And in the second part of the presentation today, I'll talk about test certification and why some people may never have any test certification because they use other ways of demonstrating compliance. So I'll talk a little bit more about technical documentation. So as expected, the BTHA has a primary authority assured technical documentation guide. So the contents of the technical file review, I've showed a picture of a of a filing cabinet with a file, just to say at the bottom there, it does not have to appear in a physical place or be altogether in a file. As long as the information is all readily available and can be given to you, then that's enough. So the technical file should contain a detailed description of the design and manufacture, including a list of components and materials used in the toy, as well as safety data sheets on chemicals used. So what that really means is you'll be expecting to see a product specification and pictures and perhaps photographs. You need to see a bill of materials, so what this product is made of. With regards to safety data sheets, they're only required for formulations. They're not actually required for finished toys. So you need safety data sheets if someone was supplying paints or that type, or glues or that type of thing. You'll need to see the safety assessment, and it's part of the requirements for a technical file. And this is not test certification. This is a separate thing that manufacturers have to do. They have to carry out a safety assessment, and that's sort of looking for things that aren't covered by harmonised standards if they've used the standard route. The conformity assessment procedure used, that should be documented. Any EC declarations, an EC declaration of conformity, sorry, and that will in future be a UK declaration of conformity. the addresses of places of manufacture and storage. This is a good opportunity to say that of course a company will have that, but it may not be within the QA department's actual technical files. It will be within the business and they can get you that. Any copies of documents submitted to a notified body. This is for particular types of toys which are EC type approved. This is quite rare within the toy industry. So, so if a toy has been EC type approved, they need to keep those documents. And then here we are, test reports and descriptions of the means whereby the manufacturer has ensured conformity of production with the harmonised standards. So how do they make sure everything complies as production goes through? And a copy of the EC type examination certificate if applicable. As I've said, EC type examination is quite rare for toys at the moment. And again, it doesn't have to appear in a physical place or be altogether in a file. So we've talked a little bit about obligations of economic operators. So I'm just going to reiterate the responsibilities in terms of technical documentation. So the manufacturer, their primary obligation is to draw up the technical documentation and carry out the conformity and safety assessments as part of that. The importer only has to ensure the technical documentation has been drawn up. So they don't have to do it. They don't actually have to have it. It can be sufficient to check that the manufacturer has systems and procedures in place to do it. So if an importer was importing a really big well-known brand company that was an American brand, it can be sufficient to say, well, can you just outline what you do? And the American brand will say, well, yes, I do this, I do safety assessments, I do this, and I've got bill of materials, and that can be enough. They don't have to have the actual technical documentation for every single product. And in fact, that could be a competitive issue, because a lot of importers can also be retailers who won't make their own brands. However, we do say if obtaining the technical documentation is likely to be an issue when requested to do so by you guys in market surveillance, then it actually is prudent to hold the documentation in the UK. So it's not one size fits all. I think importers need to look at their supply chain and go, well, actually, do I think that they've got it, and do I think that they can provide it every time I need it? And if they don't, then perhaps they need to do a little bit more work in actually holding it. A distributor, as I said before, doesn't have any obligation about technical documentation, but they must ensure that records identifying economic operators are available. So if you ask them for technical documentation, they can say, I don't have it, as I said before, but I know who does. And as we can see here, there is this increasing level of responsibility within this supply chain. Authorised representatives, again, it's different. They must keep a copy of the DOC. They can't draw up the technical documentation, but they must retain the technical documentation for you to see. So this is the second half of the presentation. So we'll all have a sip of coffee. I'm going to talk to you about what it means for conformity assessments and compliance strategies. So again, we have a conformity assessment guide within the series of BTHA guides. So what is a conformity assessment? Well, the conformity assessment is the demonstration that the toy is in conformity with the safety requirements of the Toy Safety Directive. So again, we remind ourselves of what these requirements are. So the safety requirements are here. So when toys must be safe when they're used as an intended or foreseeable way, considering their foreseeable and normal period of use, and also the inherent hazards and risk of harm must be warned against. So just a reminder of those. And then the particular safety requirements, again, a reminder of these. These are more prescriptive. Now, I listed them before, physical and mechanical, flammability, chemical, electrical. This is actually an extract from the Toy Safety Directive. So these are the particular safety requirements. So this is a list part of, you can see it's cut off at the bottom of the particular safety requirements with regards to the physical and mechanical properties of toys. So let's just read number 2, for example, because it's shorter. Accessible edges, protrusions, cords, cables, fastenings on toys must be designed and manufactured in such a way that the risks of physical injury from contact with them are reduced as far as possible. So that's one of the particular safety requirements. It doesn't say cords must not be 360 millimeter long. It doesn't talk about what a fastening is. It doesn't really give you any detailed information about what actually that does mean to be safe. And then, for example, number 4, toys and their parts must not present a risk of strangulation. It doesn't tell you how that happens, but it's important to know that toys must comply with these safety requirements. Complying with the standards only is one way of showing that they comply with the particular safety requirements, but a company can prove their toy complies with the particular safety requirements without testing to standards. So it's a bit confusing. Most use standards. So that page that I showed you was an extract of the mechanical and physical particular safety requirements, and there are pages and pages in the directive which talk about what it means for a toy to be safe in terms of flammability, what it means for a toy to be chemically safe, that sort of thing. You can imagine the chemical safety one is quite long. So how do I demonstrate conformity with those requirements? Because you're not demonstrating conformity with standards. So there's 2 ways. One is self-verification. So this is most toys most people will do this themselves. It doesn't require the involvement of a notified body. And it's important to note that a notified body is not any old lab. It's a particular type of lab. And then there's the second way. You can carry out an EC type approval. This is used in particular circumstances and is carried out by a notified body. So it's a laboratory certified to carry out EC type approvals on certain types of products. So I'll talk more about self-verification. How do I self-verify conformity? So the way most manufacturers do it, they do it by showing conformity to harmonized standards. But also, because they need to demonstrate the toy is safe, that's not necessarily enough. They also have to look at other aspects that perhaps may not be covered by harmonized standards, and I'll come on to that later. The other arm to this is they need to carry out a safety assessment as well. So let's talk about what are harmonized standards. So these are standards that have been listed in the EU's official journal. There is going to be a UK equivalent, apparently. They give a presumption of conformity with the safety requirements of the directive covered by that standard. So I'll talk about that in a minute, sorry. This is an extract of the European official journal, and I've said there will be hopefully a UK equivalent of this. So you can see that, for example, the first one on there is that the standard that's been listed, safety of toys, part 1, mechanical and physical properties is the standard, and it's the date, and then on the last column is the date of the cessation of the presumption of conformity with the superseded standard. So you can use the old standard for a while until it's superseded. So all of the standards which give a presumption of conformity to the safety requirements of the directive are listed in the official journal. And it's not always known this, but the harmonised standards, all of them for toys, have what's called an informative annex ZA. So if you go after this presentation, go and look at your standards. Annex ZA lists the clauses in the standard that addresses the safety requirements in the EU directive, and it demonstrates how the standard can be used as a presumption of conformity. And I'll just show you this. So this is table ZA from EN 71 part 1. So here we talked before about toys and their parts must not present a risk of strangulation. That was the clause that I read out earlier on today. And here in the standard it says these are the clauses. If you comply with these clauses, then you have a presumption of conformity with the directive. So these clauses which address strangulation are yo-yo balls, cords, chains, electrical cables, straps intended to be worn fully around the neck. So if you comply with those, you can be seen, you can have a presumption. I'm presuming that I now comply with the essential requirements of the directive. It's a bit complex. It'd be interesting to see how this is transposed into UK law. This, again, I keep listing these because it's important. These are the particular safety requirements, and there will be those within there. So we're going to now talk about standards. So we talked about using standards as a presumption of conformity with the essential requirements of the Toy Safety Directive. So these are the standards that can demonstrate compliance with the mechanical and physical aspects. Bear with me, it does get more interesting. So flammability, you use part 2, obviously. Electrical, you can use EN 62115. Hygiene, the EN 71 can cover some of the requirements for hygiene, but what it doesn't cover is it doesn't cover the requirements in the directive for the washing and labelling of textile toys, and it doesn't require any microbial aspects or not. So a toy company needs to do more if they've got anything that perhaps has something that could possibly grow microbes. For example, you'll probably be aware of the issues with bubble mixture. It's not always covered by standards. Radioactivity. There is a toy that was placed on the market here, Gilbert's Cloud Changer. This was an atomic energy lab, so it was on the market before the Toy Safety Directive banned it. There aren't any standards to demonstrate compliance with the radioactive requirements of the directive. Basically, don't make toys like this. Toys should not be radioactive. Chemical properties. So the standards, the EN 71 series of standards, I've listed them then. So you've got migration of certain elements, chemistry sets, chemical toys, finger paints, nitrosamines or nitrosamines, depending on how you say it, olfactory ball games. So there are some standards which can demonstrate compliance to certain chemical requirements. I've just put EN 71 parts 9, 10 and 11. They're not harmonised. That means they don't give a presumption of conformity. But these standards do not cover the requirements in the directive for substances and mixtures. They don't cover the requirements in the directive for CMRs, carcinogens, mutagens, and reprotoxic chemicals. They don't cover cosmetic toys, nor fragrances, nor any requirements for chemical warnings from the CLP directive. So this is why just asking for test certificates or companies who just supply test certificates, they haven't done everything they need to. CMRs are the biggie. We'll come on to these. So there are requirements within the Toy Safety Directive for substances and mixtures, and basically, in short, you can read it, but in the translation of it is that the toys need to comply with CLP, classification, labelling and packaging. CMRs. So within the directive is a requirement that CMRs category 1A, 1B, 2 shall not be used in toys, and there are exceptions. Concentrations are equal to or smaller than CLP. If they're not accessible, you don't have to comply. But there are things listed in Appendix A which permits the use. So the directive says you cannot use CMRs, but Appendix A says you can use CMRs in these particular circumstances. But what is often not known by some toy companies, I have to say, is that there are specific limit values for certain CMRs listed in the directive under Appendix C. So Appendix C lists specific lower limits for certain CMRs for toys intended for use by children under 36 months and intended for toys to be placed in the mouth. These are the restricted chemicals in Appendix C of the Toy Safety Directive, and you'll know that there isn't an EN 71 part something which covers bisphenol A, formamide, CMI-MI. I won't pronounce the other bits. Bisphenol A again, the limit changed. These TSEPs, those ones down there, they're flame retardants. I don't know what that is, and phenol. So there is a specific list of chemicals which are restricted in toys for children under 3 which go in the mouth, which do not have an EN 71 standard. Cosmetic toys, you need to comply with the Cosmetics Directive. Fragrances, there's a list of fragrances specifically listed of 55 which you can't use under a certain level, and there's a further 11 that you can use them, but you need to list the fact that you've used them on the toy. Again, no EN 71 standard. So how do you demonstrate compliance given all that, given that, you know, what we used to do is go, I'll just test to EN 71 parts 1, 2 and 3, bosh, done it. That's obviously not the case anymore. So we have a guidance document within the British Toy and Hobby Association called Compliance Strategies. So how to demonstrate compliance to these requirements. The requirements without standards, and in fact the requirements within standards. So just because there's a standard doesn't necessarily mean you need to test to it. So I'll talk a little bit about product test certificates. Test certification is often seen as the only way to check compliance. So we've already seen a problem with that because there isn't a test certificate available for those Appendix C chemicals. There isn't a standard, sorry, to test to for those Appendix C chemicals and the other requirements. Testing to standards is thought to be required. Mainly this is an issue with some of the retailers. They have a tick box and they want their test certificate, and then when they've done that, they think everything's all right. Customer enforcement requirements, often people say, well, show me your test certificate. Again, in particular, certain retailers have IT systems for test certificates. So if they can't tick their box for EN 71 part 9 or whatever they do, they can't sell the product. And that's a problem, really, considering the following. So the question really is do I actually need to test the standards? So within the Commission guidance documents, and we're hoping that these will become translated into the UK guidance documents, is all sorts of reasons why you actually don't need to test. So, for example, testing only needs to be considered for those substances that can be reasonably expected not to appear in the toy in question. So I always say that if the assessment tells us that there is no risk for certain fragrances, manufacturers do not need to test for these fragrances. If there is no electrical hazard, manufacturers do not need to test for it. I often use the analogy of a cake, and if there was a law to say you can't use red food colouring in a cake, you wouldn't test a non-coloured cake for red food colouring because you know you haven't put it in there, so why do you need to test for it? So they also allow for other evidence to show that the product complies with a harmonised standard. So it could be an internal test report, or it could be a compliance protocol. So meaning that goods in you perhaps only buy your materials from a certain authorised supplier, that sort of thing. So other means of clear verification. There's no obligation to test. So, excuse me. So this is a bridge text, but it does show that the testing is not the way necessarily you have to do it. So there is a problem actually with test certificates. So you say, well, actually I do test. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is, as we've already said, it does miss compliance requirements that are not in standards. It does not fulfil the requirement to in a directive to ensure conformity of series production. So what if the standard changed? What if you've changed your colour of your product, or you've changed the characteristics of the product? You know, some companies only test one product every 2 years. So much can change in between those times. So there is a problem with test certification. This is just another it's a chart really showing that the testing, if you test every 2 years, it's actually not representative of entire production. So I'm making my lovely duck here, and it's my lovely purple duck, and I've got my test certification done, bish bosh, I've done. I can supply that to you and everybody's happy. But production continues, so that's fine, everything's fine, and production continues, and then things start to go a little bit, oh, that's not quite, oh no, that's, oh no, this is bad. So, and then suddenly I'm making something completely different. So I've got my test certification. So that test certification that we had on the first duck that came along, it only told me about that one product, and it only told me about what had been tested. So suddenly I've been making ducks, and now I'm making a pear, although it's that's supposed to demonstrate it's all gone pear-shaped, by the way. I missed my joke. It only can tell you about that first one produced. So there is an inherent problem with how we demonstrate compliance at the moment because of this. So we've got our production and it's all going ahead, and that's lovely, and everything looks the same. So maybe I've got that, that's fine. But what if I've changed the paint supplier? What if I've actually started to manufacture in a different factory? What if I've changed the material that I've used? What if I've changed from polypropylene to ABS? What if I've just taken the tool down and polished it and then changed it and put another one on there? What if there's been a change to the standard? That test certificate that we had in the first place, even if everything looks the same, and I'm looking at my shipments and I'm doing my goods in inspection, I'm saying, yes, that duck's a yellow duck, it looks the same as that other yellow duck. We don't know that that test certificate is still valid. So there is a problem with this regularly every 1 year or every 2 years testing. Another problem with test certificates is that it actually can be unnecessary. So even when there is a standard, EN 71 Part 1, for those scissors on the left-hand side, I can tell, and most people who know the standard can tell, well, that complies with EN 71 Part 1 because it's all the parts that don't have to have sharp edges haven't got a sharp edge. It has got a sharp edge, and then I can look at the standard and say, oh, it says I need a warning about sharp edges and it only needs to be for children over 3. So I can tell myself that that complies with EN 71 Part 1. I don't need a test laboratory to tell me that that complies with EN 71 Part 1. Also, it can be unnecessarily repetitive. So some retailers, I don't think trading standards are guilty of this at all because you think more outside the box, but some retailers will say, no, I want an EN 71 Part 1 certificate for the yellow scissors, but I also want one I need a separate one for the blue scissors, and I want a separate one for the green scissors, and I don't want the green scissors, and the red scissors. So it can be unnecessarily repetitive too. So there is an alternative way that manufacturers are beginning to use now, or some have been using it for a long time, because it really is the only way. So we can demonstrate this with our polypropylene ducks, and they've got different coloured eyes. Hope you can see that. So the traditional compliance model would be to test that one, the yellow polypropylene and the red paint, and then test this one, the green polypropylene and the blue paint, and the green polypropylene and the purple paint, and the green, I can't use polypropylene, green polypropylene and red paint. So there would be 4 test certificates for that for EN 71 Part 3. You can already see that's just nonsense. So polypropylene is a low risk, or actually 0 risk, for EN 71 Part 3 compliance. If we have other resources within the BTHA where we've looked at risk of chemicals, polypropylene cannot fail EN 71 Part 3. It just can't. Any heavy metals aren't used with it anyway, and even if they are, it's bound within the matrix of the polymer, so it can't come out. It cannot fail EN 71 Part 3. The paints, however, are a higher risk for Part 3 compliance. So actually, you probably would decide that you would need to test or have some other assurance for that. So product test certificates, more of the problem here is it can divert resources. So if I'm testing every 2 years things that don't need to be tested, I'm just wasting money on testing things. And what we should be doing, I'm sorry about the text here, but it says we can either test everything every 2 years, or we can identify high risk areas and invest in ongoing compliance. So it's far better that the money goes to the high risk areas. So what we talk about within the BTHA is a new compliance strategy. Of course, we must meet legislative obligations. It requires knowledge of the product, and it requires knowledge and understanding of the supply chain. And we know that a lot of companies you deal with won't have this, but the larger companies and the companies that know what they're doing will be doing this at the moment. In order to do this, you need knowledge of the standards. So you need to sort of say, well, what can I assess myself? We already talked about the fact that I can assess whether those scissors comply with Part 1 or not. When should I use a lab? So we talked about the polypropylene, I'm not going to test that, but actually the paints on the eyes, that's quite high risk. So perhaps I should use a lab for that. Or perhaps can I review the formulation of that paint and actually decide myself whether it was going to comply? So in order to do this, you need product knowledge, and you need to know the manufacturing supply chain. It's rarely possible to know about the product without a bill of materials. It must be in the technical file. It's a legal requirement to have it in the technical file anyway, but it does enable you to identify materials common to a number of toys, for example. So when we talked about those polypropylene duck, the the polypropylene was common to one toy. So then perhaps you think about looking at that in another way. So you also need knowledge of the manufacturing supply chain. So you perhaps can identify material sources. You can identify subcontractors and vendors, and you can identify reliable material suppliers. So if you've got a high risk material such as PVC, perhaps a company would say, well, you only should be buying that PVC from that company, and you verify that supply chain, and perhaps you occasionally test to make sure that everything's ongoing. You don't need to test it as the final product. So this is all very complicated, I understand that, but in terms of enforcement, you can't really go into that level of detail. So what we've done really here is, when you're talking to a company, bad indicators, so I couldn't think of any other way of putting this, are perhaps that if you've asked them for information on the toy, if they only supply test certification, if they say, oh, here's my EN71 parts 1, 2 and 3, well, that's a bad indicator, because there are requirements, as we know, which aren't found in standards. What do they say to you if you ask them and say, can I have your technical file? And they go, well, what's a technical file? I don't understand what you mean. I've got my test certificate. I don't understand what that is. Or if they don't actually have a declaration of conformity. So many companies that don't understand the complexities of the Toy Safety Directive will still think, I just need to supply test certificates. So they don't have a declaration of conformity. It means they haven't really read the directive or the regulations or anything. Good indicators are, if you go in and say, please, can you show me your compliance or test certification? They say, well, I can't give you my test certification, but I can show you my technical documentation. They can talk to you a bit about the fact that they know the materials used in their product, they know about the supply chain, and they have really comprehensive technical files. So you don't really need to go through the technical files to verify if they're right, if they look quite comprehensive. And it takes a lot of work really to forge things within a technical file for your benefit, and you're unlikely to find it. So really, at the moment, I know resources are scarce, so these bad indicators and good indicators are probably the way to go. So how can we use this knowledge? So what when you're talking to a supplier that's sort of looking at the alternative models, have they identified areas of risk? Have they thought, well, actually, I'm using PVC, that's quite a high risk for phthalates, I'm going to do more on that? Have they looked at mechanical and physical risk, hygiene? And have they actually looked at areas of little or no risk? So if they've got toys which are for over 3s, made of really generic materials, then perhaps they're not spending so much time on that. And that's okay, because you need to divert the resources to where you want to. So the nice little diagram shows that, you know, you should be looking in the high risk areas and not necessarily so much in the low risk areas. So how do companies use this knowledge? Well, they can use this knowledge in allocation of resources and testing budgets. Using declarations of conformity in lieu of testing. I would only advise this on low risk materials, low risk products, that sort of thing, but it's allowed. They can self-certify for certain aspects. That's okay. They don't have to have independent testing or anything. They can target their testing. So they can, instead of testing one toy for everything every 2 years, maybe they test every single shipment of a PVC toy for phthalates and organotins. Maybe they spend their money in that way. So, as I said, more frequent testing of other measures for high risk areas, and perhaps no testing of other areas which are low. So there are alternative ways of doing this. This has all been quite complex, I understand that. and I think doing this sort of training via Zoom when you're sitting in the comfort of your own home, or maybe not, with children around you and pets, is difficult. So there will be questions. I'm sure there will be questions. If you have any, please feel free to drop me an email, and I will attempt to answer any of those questions that you have, or if you need further information. We are, as an association, trialling virtual training in modules. So again, if you are interested in that, if you would like to do it on an authority by authority basis, we are trialing it with one authority at the moment, and we're doing a 4-week course where we're going into more details about certain aspects. So if you would like more information about that, or you would think you would find that of interest, we can certainly provide that. So again, email me separately. I'm assured that these slides will be available to you on request. I'm not sure who from, but I hope you have enjoyed or tolerated or got through to the end of this presentation. Thank you for your patience, and hopefully I will see some of you or all of you in person next year.